Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to last week. For once, the video is almost in sync with reality. This week we are going to make a resin casting of the maquette we made before Christmas. We've already made the sculpture. Here's the quick version of how that happened, and there's a link below if you want to watch a slower, more in-depth version. And then we made a silicone and plaster mold real fast. And there's a link for that in the description below as well, if you're interested. So this leaves us at the last step in the process. A sculpture is born, it dies, and it is reborn. And the process you're about to watch is the rebirth, a resin rebirth. We are of course not using real casting resin here. If you're used to the channel, you have seen this type of material before. We're not using synthetic casting resin. We are using a product called hydro resin. Sometimes it's called aqua resin, sometimes jesmonite, sometimes acrylic polymer. It has many names depending on where in the world you are located. It's a kind of an extra hard plaster that we reinforce with fiberglass for extra strength. It's unlike regular casting resin in that it doesn't pour real well and needs to be brushed into an open-faced mold to get a good result, usually at least. Think of it like an epoxy or polyurethane resin, just less toxic, less temperamental, and a lot more forgiving. It's a great material and I definitely recommend it. Mix ratio is about 2 parts powder to 1 part liquid with this specific brand, but you can always vary this depending on the work you are performing. You can mix a thicker batch for fixing seams and filling holes, for example, or you can mix a really thin coat if you need the material to run a little bit easier. For the splash coat, I'm trying to get all the details in the surface of my silicone, which is of course the surface of my sculpture, and so around 2:1 mix ratio is okay. With practice and experience, you get used to what kind of ratios you like to work with and when it's appropriate to change the ratio. I brush it into my open-faced mold, doing my best to get even coverage and avoid pulling. The material doesn't warp much, so with some materials you have to watch out for pulling because if one area is thicker, it'll heat up more, causing the material to warp. You don't really have to worry about that too much with this material. I've never noticed any warping, but it's always a good idea to have even thickness for weight distribution to ensure the figure stays balanced once it's standing on its own. You definitely want to work clean and avoid a mess as much as possible. Staying off the silicone edge where the 2 pieces of the mold are meeting is of course preferable, so that the mold closes a little bit easier. However, with such a tiny mold, it's not very easy to stay completely off the edge. So having a spatula you can clean up the edge with while working is both useful and smart, I think. If you let the material set up before cleaning up, you could introduce cracks in the splash coat while breaking off stray pieces of resin. So I prefer to do cleanup while the material is still liquid and soft. I get even coverage all over the place, make sure that there's no translucent areas or anything weird like that, and then I let the material set up. Depending on the mix ratio that you've made, this might take anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour with this particular brand. That might change depending on your brand. As you might notice, it changes color a bit from grayish to brownish once it sets up. The color change makes it obvious when the material is ready for the layer of fiberglass. Sadly, I forgot to start the camera early enough, but I'm sure you can see the metal wire inside one of the legs. This is just a piece of aluminum wire and it's probably not even necessary, but it's there to make sure the ankles don't break. It's kind of a insurance policy, let's call it. Probably not necessary with this material, it's pretty strong, but might as well add it, it's easy enough. I lay it down into the mold and I bend it to the proper shape, making sure no part of the wire sticks up outside the borders of my mold. Aluminum is really flexible. It's the same material I use for armature wire and you can get it at most hobby stores. And it's not very difficult to bend to the correct shape so that it fits nicely inside the mold. Then I use more resin and lay small pieces of pre-cut fiberglass on top to lock it in place. I pre-cut the fiberglass before I begin laying it down to save myself some hassle, some stress, and to be able to work a little bit cleaner. The fiberglass is the reinforcement that'll make the cast really strong. To ensure that you'll be able to close the mold with minimal cleanup, you should avoid having the fiber go above the silicone edge or on top of the silicone edge. If it does, the mold won't close and you'll have to sand it down. And the best way I've found for sanding it down, in case you do make a mistake here, is a Dremel tool. It makes short work of the resin without being too aggressive and taking away too much. One thing I've learned by using this material several times is to do my utmost to work clean and create as little of a mess as possible. Now, before, fiberglass was usually the messiest part of the process for me, and so to combat that, I have come up with a way of working to minimize the mess. Now, it's not a very original way, so it's nothing revolutionary really. Essentially, I just brush resin into the mold and lay dry fiber that's been pre-cut into the wet resin and let the resin set up, holding the fiber in place. Then I mix up more resin and brush it on top of the dry fiber, which is now locked into the mold from the bottom. The messy way I used to go about doing things was to brush the resin into the fiber and then lay it into the mold. But this always turned into a mess, with hands all over the place, rushing to brush the resin before it's set up into the fiber and get it in the right place. And because of the weight of the resin in the fiber, it usually, or almost always, meant that some of the pieces would slide around or fall off. But with dry pieces of fiber, this doesn't seem to happen at all. They're very light and they stick to resin a lot easier. It's definitely a bit slower, but a lot more controlled, especially considering that for the most part I'm a one-man operation, having to deal with the resin, the casting, the fiberglass and the camera. So it's for me, it's perfect. The coat of resin on top of the fiber should be pretty liquid to make sure the resin runs into all the nooks and crannies of the fiber, filling every hole. This is very important so that there are no air bubbles between the resin splash coat, which is the surface of your sculpture, and the fiber, as this can be a weak spot prone to cracking or breaking, usually making a little annoying hole in the surface of your sculpture that you'll have to patch later on. Once the resin and fiber is bonded and set up, and again you can tell this by the color, at least with this brand of resin, it's time to close the mold. To close the mold and make sure the seams are filled, I mix up a thick batch of resin and use a spatula to add it along and on top, a little bit on top of the silicone edge of the mold. Once I close the mold, I'll squeeze out all the excess and hopefully end up with a nice tight seam. It's a very useful technique to fill up the arms or the legs or other thin areas where liquid resin would have a hard time running in once the two sides of the mold are stuck together and the space that the resin has to run in becomes very tight. So I find it worked pretty well in this case. Because the arms are thin, filling them with resin won't add too much weight anyway, and so that won't be a problem. And the legs, supporting all the weight, needs to be strong, so filling them is not really a problem either. I find that bungee cords are your best friend when holding a mold together. Just make sure the two halves don't slide around when you tighten the bungee cords on, so you don't end up with some sort of misregistration. So you just want to pay attention that the two pieces are well registered together after the bungee cords are attached. You can also use tape. I know a lot of people use tape. I just think it's a bit of a waste, and to save the environment and all that stuff, bungee cords seem to work out fine. This, I think, is a good time to mention Patreon. If you are interested in learning sculpture from me personally and get feedback on your work either on email or via video chat, my Patreon is the place for you. You'll get in-depth feedback on techniques and how you can apply them to your own work. Anything sculpture related goes. We can talk about armatures, supplies, mold making, anything you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. So check it out. The link is in the description below. Once the resin is cured, you can open the mold. If all went well and you planned out the mold properly, you should have an easy time opening the mold and revealing the cast. The material doesn't really stick to silicone at all. It's nice to have a little piece of foam or something else that's soft, a pillow or a towel, whatever you can get your hands on that's soft, that you can use to put the cast down on so it doesn't lay directly on your table, which, if you're like me, is probably a disastrous mess. And small pieces of resin could potentially scratch your cast and stuff like this, so having something soft and clean to lay the cast down on is really, really useful. So at this stage, there were a few things that I forgot to film. I must have had too much lunch or something like that. One of them is adding a piece of fiberglass on the inside of the mold across the seams to lock the two halves together. Now this is kind of a safety measure. It probably didn't need to happen considering the resin that I already added to both sides of the seams would have held the piece together, but with the fiber installed, nothing but the apocalypse will part the two halves of the mold from each other. And the cast came out really nice with minimal damage, air bubbles, and seams to fix, which always makes me happy. Okay, what now? I have a bottom and a top half, and they obviously need to be attached together somehow. And this is where the loose piece of fiber hanging out of the top half comes in. I will use this piece of fiber to hold the top and the bottom together. First I did a little test fitting and it fits. Not only does it fit in this case, but it balances nicely on top of the legs, which makes everything easier. Otherwise you have to come up with some sort of rig to support the two pieces in the correct position, which always is difficult. So what I do is simply fill the legs with resin, and I made sure that the resin didn't run through the legs before I did this. And then I drench the loose piece of fiber hanging out from the top half in resin, and then I put the two pieces together. The fiber will hang down, helped by gravity, into the liquid resin in the legs, and once it all sets up, it'll attach together very, very well. Now, depending on your piece, you want to think this through very thoroughly so that you can use gravity to assist you in making the fiber go where you want it to go. If I had the loose piece of fiber attached to the legs, there's no guarantee the two pieces would hold together because wet fiber doesn't really hold itself upright and it would just collapse back down into the legs. But with the fiber attached to the top half and assisted by gravity, it goes into place into the correct position without me touching it. And usually when you do this type of procedure, it is because you can't touch the seam. So it's very important that the fiber does what you want it to do on its own. It's a pretty clever technique. There is of course a bit of a seam where the two pieces meet, and with some resin I fill whatever gap there is. There were some air bubbles, some defects, and some visible seams in the sculpture that needed fixing, so once the resin holding the two halves together is set up, I mixed up a thick batch of resin to fix those. And I'm always careful to add as little resin as possible because I have to get rid of the resin that's excessive anyway. And so adding as little resin as possible is really helpful. To clean it up and get rid of excess resin, I use a knife and sandpaper. And I think in this case I used 80 grit, 150 grit, 220 grit, and finally 330 grit, which I used most over the surface actually, just to kind of smooth it down a little bit. Before painting, you want to wash the cast thoroughly with water and dishwashing soap, getting rid of all the dust from sanding and whatever oil is left from the silicone and your dirty hands. Now I didn't film the washing, and I didn't film when I spray painted the sculpture either, because then I need to take the camera out, and I usually have the camera attached to power and the battery wasn't charged, etc, etc. Excuses. I didn't film it, but you can imagine me spray painting. Anyway, it's pretty simple. Just follow the directions on the can and build up the layers of the spray paint slowly, making sure not to drench your sculpture, causing drips. Now to finish this piece, I won't be using paint, however. You've seen me use oil paint before, but this piece needed to be shipped pretty much instantly. And when that's the case, oil paint is not your friend. It can take weeks and weeks and sometimes months to set up, to dry. So I used brown wax, simply added with a brush. Pretty much straightforward. I think I added 3 layers, something like that. You can also do this technique with translucent wax and add your own color with pigments. And you could spray paint it a different color for different effect as well. The world is your oyster, and the choices in colors are endless. So with 3 layers on the sculpture, I didn't really like it, and I kind of had a moment of panic and terror. During my moment of panic and terror, I decided to try and rub some of the wax off with a piece of paper towel, my fingers, and a dry brush. And the dry brush was the best tool, I think, for warming up the wax a bit, which made it a bit easier to remove with the paper towel, and my fingers helped remove some of the brush and towel strokes. As I said, try this technique out yourself, mix up the base color, create your own colored wax. The possibilities are endless, and the finish, once the wax firms up, is actually pretty durable. If you want to see this sculpture for yourself, along with several others of my sculptures, it'll be in New York City at Stone Sparrow Gallery in Greenwich Village on June 22nd for their inaugural opening exhibition. And if you end up going to this show, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you if you go. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, I encourage you to check out my Patreon page. I give feedback and critiques on people's work, and we talk about whatever you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. So check it out, the link is in the description below. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for a new video next Thursday. Subscribe and hit the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and share with your friends and family. It really helps me out a lot. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.